Every major shift in history has created two kinds of people: the ones who got replaced by technology and the ones who learned how to use it. In history, when machines took over the manual labor work, it wasn't the workers who lost, it was the ones who didn't learn how to work with machines. And today, the same thing is happening again. But this time is not machines, it is automations and AI. AI agents and automation tools like n8n are literally transforming how businesses operate. After the born of AI agents, we started to notice that more and more repetitive work is disappearing, and people who know how to build these AI agents and these automation workflows are the ones who are going to be designing the future. That's why, in my opinion, learning automation skills nowadays is super valuable to future-proof yourself. The only difference right now is that you don't really need an automation degree, an engineering degree, or even learning how to code to be able to build these AI-powered workflows. Nowadays, we have these no-code tools like n8n, make.com, even Zapier, that allows you to build AI workflows, connect them to the different apps that you use every day, and add AI on top of that to augment the way you do your work. So by using simple nodes, you can have an entire digital workforce that can help you to achieve your goals and be more productive. That's why I decided to create this crash course where I will show you the ins and outs of n8n so you can start using AI in your everyday job, so you can boost your productivity and future-proof your skills. I will try to cover the main concepts and the different nodes that exist so it gets you actually started with automations. So if you found this helpful, I would really appreciate if you can leave a like and subscribe to the channel. And if you found this interesting, I post many different videos about n8n and automations as well, so make sure to check them out. Let's jump in. So to start, I would love to discuss with you what is this revolution with these low-code tools that recently start popping out on everybody's radar. More specifically, I want to discuss n8n, which is this tool that now exploded in popularity due to the ability of building AI agents. AI agents, if you're unfamiliar with the concept, is basically these LLMs and thinking agents. Think of it as your marketing manager or any other personnel in your company that can do specific tasks. They can send information over multiple software, they can strategize, they can think, and they can be connected to different applications. For example, Slack, they can be connected to Jira, and they can perform certain tasks to some degree autonomously. Previously, when you needed to develop such AI agents, you had to write a lot of code, which was really complicated, and all that knowledge was reserved to the people who knew how to code. But thankfully, thanks to tools like n8n, you can do these things right now by basically copying and pasting these nodes and writing simple prompts in natural language, like in English, which makes it super popular for non-technical teams. To start with n8n, you can either get their subscription, so you can actually buy their cloud version, which I would recommend because it's easier. However, there are other options. You can install it on your computer, so you can use it actually for free, because here, if you look at the pricing, you have to pay 20 euros per month or dollars for whatever you are staying. And there is some limitations to the workflow. So if you want, you can self-host it on your computer for free. So it requires some technical knowledge to be able to install it. However, that is also possible. So if you actually buy it and sign in, you will see such a dashboard. Inside, you will see multiple of these workflows, as I call them. And inside these workflows, you can also put stuff in folders. And this is basically what we will be working with. This is the main user interface that you will be interacting with. And there are multiple of these nodes that I will explain in this course in more details, and this would already cover around 70 to 80% of the stuff that you will be using in n8n on a daily basis, which should already get you covered to already start practicing, because I believe the easiest way to learn automations and to learn how to learn a new language is by practicing. So I would recommend you, the moment you are familiar with these main basic concepts of n8n, to immediately start working on some real-world project. And if you don't know what real-world projects you could do, I have a free community that we post all these real-world projects that we've built in n8n by having customers asking for these automations. So you can get inspired there and try to build your own and replicate it. So I would also recommend you to check that community in the description. All right, with that being said, let's start with the first lecture. So in this video, I'm going to show you all the different ways that you can trigger an n8n automation. Let's go. So the first type of triggers is the schedule trigger. It looks like this, where you define when do you want the automation to be triggered. Let's say every day at midnight, please start this automation. You can click here to test it, and then you can see, okay, it got triggered. Once you define this to be active, you need to activate this workflow. So you need to click here. Now it's not going to activate because I have some errors here. I didn't authenticate, but technically every workflow that is activated and it has a schedule trigger will be triggered at the time. And here you can define if you want weeks, if you want hours, months. So you have a lot of different flexibility. The second way to trigger a workflow is by connecting this chat node. And you can see it here in the open chat. Let's say hi. And then you can see that the workflow has started with a new session ID and the chat input says hi. This is usually used if you want to build chatbots. So you can see something like that. It's quite common. You have like a chatbot connected to an AI agent, and then whatever you ask some things, let's say here OpenAI, and I'm not going to even say anything. Let's just restart it and say hi. Let's see what happens. And then the AI agent respond, hi, how can I help you too? And this is literally, you've built an AI agent under like 3 seconds. So this is the second way to connect. If you want to deploy this as an actual chatbot, you can make it here publicly available. And then basically you can take this URL and you can have it deployed on your website. There's different ways. You can have an embedded chat or a hosted chat. But for that, I will put this in a separate lesson. So another way to start a workflow is by using this click. Unfortunately, with this click, you can only have one click in the whole workflow. That's why I don't like it so much. I don't use it anymore. Let's say you have like 2 different lines of workflows that you just want to keep testing. I would recommend you always to add these schedules, because as you see here, we can have multiple of these schedules, and they could be, let's say this is connected to one row, this is connected to a second row, and you want to test the first row, you can just click here, it's tested. You can click here, it's tested. But this one you cannot copy. Let's see, copy. No, it doesn't let me. So I would recommend you putting as much of these schedule triggers as you want for testing. But remember, if you want to activate them, then all of a sudden these will be shooting. So that's important not to do that. But for simplicity, just so you know, you can also use this manual trigger. You can get it from here. So manual trigger, you can find it. And basically the names here, you can just type them in the chat and you can find what the trigger that I'm telling about. So another way to start a n8n workflow is by having a form, so a form submission. And technically this is, you're building an app. Let's have a look. So execute workflow. So it won't start because of the issues here. That's annoying. Let me copy it to another one. So this is how it looks like. If you execute it, it will take you to an actual UI that you can here add maybe some input criteria, like the users can say something. Wait, let me show you. So for example, here we add your name, and then here syrup, and then submit, and then we have a form. So here, basically, if you're familiar with Ali and all these kind of form builders, you can build your own with n8n. You can also customize it. So if you add here custom form styling, you can just change the colors, change whatever you want to make it more your thing. You see here this cryptic name, which I also don't like. You can also change that. So you can change form path. And then here you say, for example, test, and then it changed. So it looks prettier. Of course, if you want to access it from everywhere, you need to activate this, and then it will become the production URL. So this would be the URL that you can access this form from. And whenever somebody submits something, then it will activate this workflow. You can have here, for example, if somebody added their name, you can add them to your database, for example, Supabase. So this could be a quite common thing. So here, and then create a row, and then based on let's say here, the database, you create a table, let's say leads, and then you add this name to the lead, and then you have it in your database. Maybe you add some AI on top or something. So you can do whatever you want. Another way to execute a workflow is using this executed by another workflow. This is really nice if you want to put parts of your automation in different modules. For example, let's say you have an agent doing some things, and then you want to call a specific workflow that, let's say, add this user to your database. So the way you do this, I added it here. So call n8n. If you call this, there is here a node that is called call sub. So sub workflow. And this one is basically this one. So this would be the last step of an automation to call another workflow. And here you can specify what is the workflow you want to call. So this would be the name of the file. So here we have the file called n8n crash course, and this file should contain a executed by another workflow node, which is, you can find it here, when executed by another workflow. And here you specify the input. So I want you to pass me a variable called test, and this variable needs to be then forwarded. So if we look at the executions, we can actually see that we actually called this workflow with this variable. And here we go. So this has been called because we called this other node. And here I put inside, this is a test. So I forwarded this variable, and let's say I do certain things with it. Like here, then I take this value and maybe I save it to my database. You can see it from here. So when I called it, this is the one that I called. Here I passed here the value, this is a test. So this is how it technically works. You can call sub workflows from different parts and different files. This helps you organize your thoughts. So for example, you have here one, let's say you have a folder. Here I have n8n crash course, but let's say I have a folder and I just want in one file to handle everything related to my database. So add things to my database. So I don't want to make this too busy, right? I just want here to handle one thing and one thing only, and then I can call this other file. This would help you call different files in your n8n workflow. So super important to organize the functions and make things less messy. If we go here to app specific, so in each app, there are different ways to call the application. For example, most commonly known is like a Gmail trigger. So this one gets triggered whenever you get an email. You can specify how often. So every minute gets triggered or every hour. I would recommend whenever you're calling apps to try to make this as not every minute, but maybe like every hour, maybe, or every X. So you can say every 5 hours. And then you do this email triggers every 5 hours. So this is technically adding a schedule connected to your email, get all email basically. The same goes with, we have different applications. We have HubSpot. So here you have a trigger like when deal is created. You can see like so many triggers that you can do. But this is, as I said, you can look here into all the different apps. So here we have HubSpot, we have Salesforce, and in each app, you can go down to the triggers and see how you can trigger a workflow based on the app. So you have a task created, contact created, attachment created. And the same is in databases. For example, whenever a form is submitted on this Airtable database, trigger the workflow. So here's the trigger on Airtable event, and you can specify what is this event. A button got triggered, a workflow got submitted, or stuff like that. So it's as you see, it's really cool to connect different apps with n8n. It becomes the glue that brings all apps together. And if you want to do proper development, that's why I left this one to the last. If you need to build a backend, like a couple of different functions that you can call from your front end, this is how you see people are saying, oh, I just built my front end using Lovable and I'm using n8n as my backend. You need to create a bunch of these webhooks. So you can specify, is it a post or a get function? Usually maybe it's a post. And you can specify what is the webhook is doing. Here, call it something specific, is like get all leads, maybe something like that. And of course, add authentication. There are different authentication. I explained a couple of ones in another lesson. So make sure check that one out and respond immediately and like how to respond. Then, for example, you can connect this one to Supabase. So it would look something like this, like get all leads, and then it's connected to your Supabase. So whoever, let's say here, the Supabase, you have a table called leads, and then it would return, let's say, return all. And then technically whoever calls this URL will be able, because now we don't have authentication, so we'll be able to see the leads you have in your database. So if you have a front end that is displaying these things on the front end, this is how you basically connect a front end to n8n and to a database. So it makes it super cool. It's literally 2 nodes, and then you can display all these leads on a front end that you maybe build custom made. So this is the really cool thing. The important stuff is to add authentication to make it secure. And then here there are other things regarding security, the allowed origins and all this kind of stuff, the IP whitelisting. So once you're building apps, just make sure to go through this as well. But as a beginner, you don't need to know all of this kind of stuff. I just want you to know that it is possible to do with n8n. So hope you enjoyed this lecture and see you in future ones. Bye. So in this chapter, we're going to be talking about the data processing nodes, which basically all the nodes that you can find under the data transformation. So I think the most important ones are the edit field node, the filter, the limit, remove the duplicates. We will also explain how to use the split out and the aggregate nodes, which might be a little bit counterintuitive. And finally, the merge node. I believe these are very important nodes because you will be using them most likely in every other automation. There's also other ones that we will not be covering in this lecture. For example, converting to file or extracting from file, which can be also important in certain use cases. But we will try to focus on the main data operation nodes. Quick remark regarding data processing nodes. Why do we need that? In almost every application that we use n8n in, there are going to be some data, and this data we need to maybe change its shape, do some manipulation to it, add some variables to it before we can maybe pass it through to an AI agent or an AI automation. And in this case, I tried to use the native data tables feature from n8n. So this is the newest feature. As I said, if you go to the data tables, I created here a table called test, and then you can add a row or a column similar to Excel sheets, basically. So you add a new column, you can add a row. So here I have like 6 rows, so just a small data that I can now change and manipulate and show you what you can do with it in terms of n8n nodes. And what I try to do for every node, I try to show you like when do you use a certain node and when you don't have to do. So the first node that we're going to be covering here is this filter node. Basically what it does, let's say we get all the data before. Here we have like, if you look in the table, so this is the table that I just showed you from the n8n. We have 6 entries, right? And I want to filter. I want to keep entries that fall under specific criteria. This is basically what it does. It can also show you the discarded, but if you look at the schema, usually you take the ones like from the kept. And inside you have certain conditions. So here, basically I tried to say keep all the rows where the condition, so the username, so this column is Sarah or Robert. And that's why if we look in the table, so in the output, we just see Sarah, Robert, Sarah. So I have like 2 entries that is called Sarah. If I look at the JSON, it returns on the kept branch, it returns the one that basically include whenever this condition is true. You can do also like an AND operation. So if you do that, nothing will be returned probably. They all will be discarded, because there is no row that it includes both, basically. So you can add here like an ignore case, which means if it's capital or lowercase, it doesn't matter. It will still match it. And if you want to use this in a future workflow, if you look here, so let's say we have a set node. You see, if everything was discarded, then we have here no data. So that's the interesting part about this filter node, that it can only show you the kept data set. So if this one is empty, that means nothing gets forwarded to future workflows. And even if you here put always output data, it will return the 3 items because we changed it. Sorry, let's do this. And so if all the data has been filtered, still nothing will be returned. That's the whole point. So it will return you like an empty JSON. Let's remove that. So that's basically the filter node. We have also here another node that is called remove duplicates. So as you saw, I added like on intention my name twice. So let's have a look here. So we have here Serap and here Serap. So once you add this node by default and then you run it, you see that nothing technically happened. And you'll be like, okay, why did this happen? Because this node looks at row level and make sure that no 2 rows have the same entries everywhere. So if you see here, this syrup and this ID is different. The same here with the ID. Also, the date of creation is different. So this node would not consider them as duplicates. It says like, yeah, the name here is duplicated, but the other entries are not. So how can we actually resolve for that? We can resolve for it by changing the parameters. I can show you from here. So here we have this clear deduplication history. What we need to do if, let's say, we want to make sure that syrup here only appears once, we can choose this one, remove items repeated within current input, and then specify which column we have to look into. For example, we can look at the ID to make sure that no 2 IDs are the same. And this is what I did here. I added it as an extra node just so you can actually see it. We choose this first one, remove from the current, let's execute previous so you can see the different rows. And here you need to see selected field, and then you choose the field that you want to filter on. So in this case, the username. And now we see syrup only appears once. So this is super helpful if you want to remove duplicates case, which is also quite common use case, I would have to say. The final node that sometimes I see people using if you want to limit certain rows. So this is just limits by the number. So pick up the first, let's say here we have 6 rows, as I showed you. We have the 6 rows, and I just want the first 3. The final will be the first 3. So pretty straightforward. Now we can enter the little bit more complicated nodes. And the first one is using this aggregate and the split out. And here I want to show you why would we need that, in which cases, and then when would we need to use the split out. And for that, let me show you a quick example of what actually happens. So let's say we have a data that contains different rows. What this actually looks like for us, it looks like this in the scheme I use. So you have a username and you have a syrup, and in the table you can receive it as one row. But imagine we need somehow to put in an AI, let's say an agent, all the different names. So we just want to extract this column and put them in a list, for example, in commas. Let's say I want to have syrup, comma, John, comma, James. So basically all the names in one go for the AI to maybe, I don't know, do something with them. Like maybe you want to write a list of all the different invites, and you would get something like this, right? So you want to have one list of all the different names. And this is what this aggregate does. Similar to its icon. So it goes over all the tables and then put them into one column, which is called the username. But this is also super useful for different cases. I'll show you here. This is why it could be useful. Let's say you want to, as a string, if you output it, then it would look something like that with commas. So now you have an actual string that contains all the different names, which previously this wasn't possible. But with the different rows, so let me show you here. If you want to make any operation, like let's say you want to add Mr. in front of every row of these rows, you can only do this if they are in a row like that. You have a username, and then usually you drag it to here, username. You see now we have syrup. So before you drag it, you just have the Mr. And then if you execute this, and then we have now a new variable called final name, and then it has this, let's say Mr. before it. So that's technically, I mean, this is just a very simple use case, but think of so many different operations that you can do. Let's say here you have numbers and then you multiply them, you create a complicated array from them. So it's super useful to even use the set node to do these kind of operations on each row. So this is the way to do that. But sometimes you call APIs, and then these APIs give you the result in a array like this. So rather than giving it to you as a table, where here is nice and then you can do the operations, some APIs give it to you as one big array. And in this case, we would need to return it to the stable format, right? And this is when the split out actually happens. So it takes an array as an input. So as you see here, an array, and then it split it out. So you would have now the same thing as you had before. So now we just reverted the aggregate function, and now we received the row with the different names. And as you see here, I added some syrup just so you can see it. And now we can add again the operations over each row. So I just wanted to show you what is the difference between these two and when to use when. I mean, right now we basically didn't do anything. We just reverted to the back case and then to be able to add this Mr. in front of each name. But it depends what you receive from the API. I have, as I said, APIs that give you stuff in already like a nice table like this, but the majority of them return it in a array that you need to maybe put again to split it out again, so you can maybe do some manipulations. One of the final nodes that I usually use a lot is this merge node. And what it basically does, imagine here, there's a lot of times where you need to do multiple things at the same time. For example, let's say we get all the names and I want to get them a discount code and I want to get their email. Let's say this is an API call to get their email. This is API call to get them a discount code. And I want the n8n to wait until all the data is here before it processes it further. And this is where this merger comes really handy, because what I sometimes see people doing is they put another set node, like let's say not a merge, but a set node, and they connect these two to one, which technically also still possible. Let me show you. So it looks something like that. So they do something like this. And unfortunately, this doesn't wait until both arrives. It kind of like whoever arrives first, it makes it new. I can show you here. And then you see it, you have like two different executions. Sometimes it's empty, sometimes it's not. A little bit unreliable. So what I usually do, I put them in the merge, and this would really make sure that we will only process things after they are added together. But inside the merge, the default one comes as an append, and this is when you add the node from n8n, it comes something like that. And it shows you here that, okay, we have a syrup and we have a discount. So ideally what I want to make is that from this table, so let's see in the table, let's have a look. So our table was username. I want next to the username to add a row called discount and a row called email for this username. And unfortunately, right now, we would have something like this. So we have a bunch of discounts and a bunch of emails, which looks a bit strange, right? Actually, here we only have double of 0. So what can we actually do to have these right next to each other? There's a function here called combine, and you can combine things by position. Here now, if we execute this, you would have for each name the email. So this is now super useful because you can also again merge it to the original table. And now you have a table where you have a username, discount, and an email, and it all works perfectly. And then you can then here do other operations, maybe add a Gmail. So you can get, this is also quite common. So send a message, then you can get someone's, maybe the name, you can say like something like this, and then always use expression. So for the expression, you can make it as a JavaScript. So you can use variables and then hi, syrup, blah, blah, or here is your discount code. And then we have a discount code and then pass. Okay, this is me sending to me. But then in the email, you can now, after the merge, you can put I want schema, I want to put this email. So now it would do it 8 times, right, for each row, but it would always take the right email, the right discount code, and the right username. So this is super useful to use in different applications. So I hope you enjoyed this lecture about the n8n data processing nodes, and I'll see you in future ones. Take care and bye-bye. So in this lecture, we will be talking about the logic nodes, and these usually you can see in this flow. Once you go to the get a new node on the flow, as you see, some of them we discussed in other lectures. So regarding the merge and filter. So technically they are also logic nodes, but more I consider stuff like if nodes, switch, waiting, and then also the looping, also executing sub workflows are more like controlling how the logic of the information flows. And let's start with the simple ones. So first of all, the if node, I'm just gonna execute the previous nodes. So as I said, we have a table of people's names just for simplicity. The if node is very similar to another node we discussed earlier. So the ones with the filter, it's basically a filter node, but the filter basically only returns to you the items where the condition is correct. The if node also gives you the ones where the condition is not correct in the false branch. So you can have access to this data. Maybe you want to do something with it. So here I just said, hey, return to me all the rows where the name is Surab. And then if it returns it, we have here 4 items where it is. And then we have also 4 items where it's not. And let's say I want to maybe send these guys an email and these guys, I send them an email or even I delete them or something. Regarding the conditions, you can do a condition based on very different data types. So we have strings. With strings, it's basically, is it equal to, does it contain something? Is it empty? The numbers, it's like, is it greater or equal? Is it less? For the dates, is it before or after? Boolean, also, is it true or false? And so on and so on. For arrays, this is where it has something that is a little bit more complicated. For example, if an array, let's say a list of all these names, and then we say, oh, does it contain the name Jerry, for example? And here we see it doesn't. It only contains Rob, John, James, Robert, and so on. So you can experiment with these things and then see how it works. The if node is very important. I use it also a lot in my work. The same goes for the switch. And the if, as you saw, is like binary, yes or no. The if allows you to do multiple. The switch allows you to do multiple of different cases. For example, I want to find out the names that are Rob, Tom, and everybody else. So if we execute it, I like this feature where you can rename the output. So whenever a row passes this check, it goes through the node Tom. So if you see here we have Tom, Rob, we have the Rob ones, and the fallback, if you go to the option, so this usually doesn't exist. So if I do this, we only see Rob and Tom. And then if you add the option, and then if you look at fallback output, and then here you need to choose extra outputs, then you get the fallback. So you get all the rest basically, which is sometimes might be useful. And I like it here because you have the output called in the names. So you know exactly what is happening. So this is also part of writing good manageable workflows, is like you document everything in the outputs, in the name. So here you don't just say if, you rename this to if username is Surab. So once you hand this over to somebody, or even you go and watch it again at some later point, just by looking into it, you know exactly what it does. So you don't need to go enter here and then see, oh, what am I calling here? And imagine here, you don't even have data. So you don't even know what that is. So it just makes it much easier and convenient. If we move forward regarding the other nodes, as you saw here, we have 8 items and we have a option to choose a specific number of loops for the nodes. For example, we can iterate over this list, not by like grabbing all these 8 rows, but we can grab maybe 2 rows at a time in terms of a batch. So we can, as you see here, we have a 2, you can change it to 3 and then call it again. And we have 3. And it basically, it loops over the rows with a specific number of loops. Usually here you have a batch of 1 and then you get 1 row at a time and then you do certain things. Let's say here you call maybe OpenAI just with this username and then you wait. When is this useful? This is useful, for example, if you're calling an AI or an API, and if you call it directly from here, like let's say here we have an OpenAI and then send a message, and then you are trying to call it with the username, let's say like here. So right now you're sending kind of like 8 requests at the same time, a specific, just 1 row, not to overwhelm some APIs. And also for that, you can have another node, which is called the wait. And this wait, basically you can adjust based on how many requests does an API accept per minute. So you can adjust your calling so you don't get blocked. So for example, certain APIs allow you only to send 50 calls per minute, which I've had this before. So that means you need to make sure that you combine the loop with the wait so that you are under this threshold. Otherwise, it will actually block you and won't be allowing you to call more APIs. So this is a very useful node to use in these kind of scenarios. Another useful one, which is called the stop an error. So here, in case you receive an error, now let's open it. Let's say something is not an error. So you can have here an if node, and this is actually quite good. So let's say whenever the name Surab pops in, so it is true, I want you to return an error. So, and it actually returned an error, and we can see that it's returned an error in our execution. You might usually in n8n, if something fails, it will return you an error. But in this case, there is no error here, right? So we just have like a name, but we want to induce an error. We want, like, whenever Surab happens in the dataset, I want an error. I mean, this maybe doesn't make sense here, but I'm sure you can think of use cases where that makes sense, where you see something in the data that you want to be notified. So there are a couple of ways to also be notified. So usually every node in n8n, if you click on the settings, it usually stops the workflow whenever the error happens. But let's say you don't want that. Let's say you want to acknowledge that there's an error and then save it maybe to a data set or a database or something like that. So you can do that. So right now, if we activate this one, you see it moved forward, and then we can maybe take this and then save it in a database. But in this case, maybe you don't even need this stop an error. I would only use it in case where I encountered something in the data that I really don't want to see, and I want my engineers or me to be notified, like, hey, check, something wrong happened. It could be that some data ranges, let's say here we have maybe, I don't know, heights, and somebody's height is higher than 500 meters or something like that. So it's like, hey, this is way outside the range, like stop. We have something off in the measuring system. So this is usually quite helpful, not to keep piling up these errors down the line and to stop the workflow. The final logic that took me a little bit of time to understand, actually, it wasn't so easy. So if you go to the executions, so execute sub workflows, you can click this one and then you end up here. So what this one does, imagine you have different logics in different files here. So we have here the n8n crash course, but let's say we have here save to database. So whenever, let's say I have here some logic that does the database and is saved under a workflow, which makes it all modular. You can also see all the executions that here happened. You kind of like minimize the concerns. So if anything goes wrong with saving to the database, you know, you always go to this file and then you always check here for these executions. So n8n allows you to call other workflows from this workflow using this execute sub workflows. And technically what you need to do is from the list, you define where is that workflow is. And then here, because I specified a parameter, I called it, you can add another one if you want. And then I called the parameter name because I need a name to add it to the database, right? And right now, if I call this one, so if now we have 4 data, and if I call it, that will save 4 SUROPs in the database. So 4 new ones. And that's why here we have even, it's piling up. If I refresh this page, we have now like 3 SUROPs. And if I call this, let me execute the workflow. So it's been called 4 times. Let's see, refresh, and we have 4 more times. And then if we look here to the executions, we have the execution with the 4 items. So it passes 4 items. So it passes a list of 4 items and then they get added. Here I just added like insert and then insert the files, which is super cool. This is super handy. You can also do it. You see the waiting node was still waiting to run. So what I've also seen people doing, you can do it in the AI agent as well. So you can, if you have an AI agent, you can have a tool to call an n8n workflow. So here we say save to DB and call this tool to save a name to database. And you click here and then you let the AI decide. So right now, if you're working with this AI agent and you say, hey, save these names to the database, it will actually call this file and then would add it to the data, which is super handy, right? To give your AI agents all these functionalities. But don't be worried, we're going to discuss the AI agents and AI nodes next. So stay tuned and I hope you enjoyed this lecture. See you in next ones. So in this lecture, I'm going to discuss all the AI and LLM nodes that n8n offers out of the box and when to choose which one. Let's start with the most basic to more complicated nodes. If you see here, we have a couple of different LLMs that provide a certain function out of the hood. And let me add this schedule trigger. So the first one that we have is a basic LLM chain. And the idea here is that simply you define a prompt for the LLM and then a system instructions as you usually do, even with ChatGPT. And then you would have a very specific way to do certain things. You have like a custom GPT, basically. So let's say like here, I always wanted to say it's cold because we're in Berlin, and it is cold in Berlin today. This was like a silly example, but technically this is ChatGPT that is kind of, I'm using ChatGPT. Like it doesn't have to be ChatGPT. It can be any LLM, but it's fine-tuned to do a very specific task. You can technically do the same thing with calling the LLM directly. So from the provider, here you have the simplicity to swap any LLM that you need. So here you can have a model, so you can connect it with Gemini, you can connect it with Cursor, you can connect it with whatever model provider that you want. You can just add them there. Or you can call the actual provider directly, which you can see here. So you can see OpenAI, you can call it directly using this one, message to a model, and then basically do the same thing. The second cool LLM that you usually gonna need is this LLM chain. You have a couple of predefined use cases. So initially, when LLMs came out, the most common use cases were somehow analyzing sentiment, extracting some information, and classifying text. So these are like the most common use cases that you might face. And that's why n8n provided you with a pre-made LLM block that you can reuse. So let's see what this one does. So in text classification, common use case maybe in e-commerce is that you have certain product description, usually much longer, and you need to find the category. This is a liquid, like maybe the size, blah, blah, blah. So, this can go like really much more complicated. And technically you can replicate this exact same thing using the basic LLM chain, but here it just made it much easier to do so. So if we execute this node, we would notice that, yes, it's a liquid branch. So the liquid branch goes here, and then maybe you can save it in a database that it says it's liquid. So this is usually in AI and machine learning called a classification task. The same would go to the information extraction. Let's have a look. So let's say here you have some text, and then the text is Syrup is a content creator, and you want to extract information. It's like, okay, what is the name of the person? What is the profession? You can specify if this attribute is required or not. And then the output would look exactly like that. So you extract information from usually not one sentence, but you have like maybe pages and pages of different content on different text. And this is super helpful. Once you extract all of these, you can then put them in a structured database, like maybe an Excel sheet or Supabase or whatever database that you have. And then you can, I don't know, maybe you want to send email to these guys with their actual name. This is now possible because of this LLM. This was not possible a couple years ago without major effort. So we had like specialized small models that were doing this. And now you can basically do it with ease using these large language models, which makes it much nicer. The last use case is the sentiment analysis. This is very common in maybe product feedback or anything that you might encounter, maybe YouTube videos. So if I see something like syrup videos suck, then it's a negative sentiment. You can define here the categories. You can also have other categories that you want to define. This is, again, you can then put it in a database. You can do some analytics on top. So you can use these three kind of nodes much easier, and all can have very specific LLMs. Like it's an LLM agnostic. You can use whatever LLM that you want. The other ones that I mentioned is calling the provider directly. So you have here multiple providers. You have the OpenAI, you have, let's see, Gemini, Google Gemini, you can call it as well. And the thing that you might notice once you create like an OpenAI node here, it has the same thing. So you have the user message and then you have the system prompt. So you're a helpful assistant. I'm sure you've seen this before. But what is interesting is that these nodes have now tools. What does that make it different than this AI agent? You probably are asking yourself, because I also ask myself the same thing. Like, what is the difference between calling OpenAI from here versus creating an AI agent and then calling the AI agent from there? So let's do that. Let's compare. So these two have the same system prompt, which is your helpful assistant. I like to do it like this. Connected to my calendar. You are available to retrieve the appointment that I have and give me a summary about what I need to do. They're both connected to the same model, so GPT 4.1 mini. And I ask it, can you please check what appointments do I have this week and help me prepare for them and send me an email with the plan. So a couple of different things, right? So check what it is, help me prepare, and send me an email. I do the same thing with the AI agent, literally copy pasted both things. And let's have a look. Let's trigger both of them and see what would be the final result. As we see here, the AI agent already called my tool. So it checked what are the events that I have for this week and sent me an email with the result. When we look at the OpenAI one, it now also checked my calendar and also called my email. So this is an interesting concept because both things kind of did the same thing. It seems that n8n have created kind of the same things under two. So there's also some memory. I mean, this one is missing some of the stuff. For example, let's see, I think can we connect it to an output parser as well? So let's see, output parser. Well, it's called here output format. But yeah, there is like very few difference between both approaches. The AI agent is usually more used whenever there's a chatting. I would tend to use this block more than using just like an OpenAI node. But basically, as you saw, this one is also able to call multiple different tools, strategize the same kind of stuff as an AI agent. But sometimes actually this node, similar to the AI agent, they forget to call some tools. So it depends on the LLM. So I would recommend whenever something is complicated, you need to strategize and maybe call different tools. Just use this AI agent node. It also has the memory if you're chatting with it. The memory is not so necessary if you need to call it in an automation. But if you have a chat with it, then definitely use the memory. It also comes with an output parser, which I like. And now like to the question, which one to use when? If you have a very simple workflow, it's just like input, output, input, output. You can see here if the workflow is a text classification, use one of these things. If it's like a very defined use case that fall under these nodes, then just like pick them up, use them. I think it simplifies or speed up the development. You can use basic LLM chains like this one if you don't want to be dependent on a LLM provider. So you can swap OpenAI with other ones. If you know that you're only going to go with OpenAI and you don't need a chain and you don't need an output parser and all this kind of stuff, you can just go directly here and define what you want to do. Just be in mind that sometimes this also works as agentic behind the scene. So this is not as clear as this one. So it's not just A to B, so one flow, but it could be also iterating multiple times. If we look at the logs, so it did multiple things. It called the two different tools, for example. While here it will be just input, output. There is no iterations. Here also with the AI agent, you see the max iterations are 10. So it thinks a couple times. Look how many times it thought. It got got the output, and then it created the email. I mean, we can go to the emails and compare the results and see actually the AI agent maybe has a better result. But just to keep that in mind, like these, if you connect them to tools, they might act as agents without noticing. So just to keep that in mind. Finally, we have this little sad guy, Llama servers. So here, if you need a private AI, so you can deploy Llama on your machine, whether it's on your Mac or if you have a cloud, for example, hosting you can deploy these LLMs and then use them without actually calling OpenAI. And some LLMs are actually quite powerful, so they work in a similar fashion to OpenAI, but you never share your data with them and you stay all in your private cloud. n8n has provided multiple of these tools to make it easier. For example, here, or you can call the Llama directly, so Llama model. So you don't need to use this node, but you can use something like the LLM chain and then connect it to an Llama from here. But yeah, this would require some setup. Smaller models work on a CPU, but the larger the models, it gets more complicated. So that's it. I hope you enjoyed this lesson about AI nodes, and now hopefully it gives you more of an understanding when to use which AI node. Take care and see you in the next lecture. So in this lecture, we're going to be talking about databases. One of the main things that make n8n super powerful is that it makes interaction with databases so much easier. For example, if you have Supabase, you can literally save entries, get entries, do all the operations that you usually do with databases, even within the user interface. So here you can get all the leads. You can get only 50. Let's say you have a table called leads on your database. You can delete, you can create, you can even update, or you have like a custom API call if it doesn't include any of these things. You can also filter based on some conditions. For example, let's say the lead is in Germany or in another country. So you can add many different filtering criteria if you have that as a column in your database. This is what I love about n8n, because when I was designing an app, literally just to create these operations, it took me maybe a week to write all of these things in code, to define the schema and then upload. But nowadays, there is these easy databases like Supabase, makes it super, super simple. And even n8n made it even easier by integrating native database solution. So if you go to n8n, if you go here to data tables, this is like still in beta, this feature, but you can literally create a table here, call it test or whatever, and you can build it slowly. Let's say add a column, a user name, and then it's a string. You can define the type. It's a string, add a column, and you have your username, and you can start to add the data. This helps, is quite useful if you're doing some tests, right? Usually people are connecting n8n to Excel, which is okay, but honestly, sometimes it's a pain. So if you go here and then you go to the test, let's get it. And then you can see in the table, we have 0. So it's just now much easier to have some test data there and then connect it to this n8n table. You're still here. You don't need to jump in between Excel or even Supabase. Supabase goes very well for like actual applications, but yeah, for quick testing, maybe try to use the new feature. It's really cool. We also have support for Airtable. If you're unfamiliar with Airtable, is a very cool database that is interactive. You can add some dashboards on top. It's really pretty. So I usually use this to build automations for clients. It has the same functionality as Supabase, but it has some nice user interface. So some clients prefer this one. It has also some access to databases that are like usually on big clouds, like this big Google BigQuery. You can also integrate it with it based on the credentials and then send a SQL query. So it can also be integrated with these big players. So usually if you have a massive data, you don't see it on like Excel sheets, or you don't, like I'm talking about millions of rows. It's usually in a BigQuery database. So you can technically also call it, but then you would have some performance issues depending on where you deployed the n8n. If you're deploying it in your house and you have like enough resources, should be fine to process this data. But if you're buying the deployed version from n8n itself, then here, if you call millions of rows, it might crash your servers. So I wouldn't recommend it. But I just want you to know that it is possible. The last type of databases, you probably have heard about them, is the vector databases. So vector database is very helpful, for example, for RAG application. Let's say you have a knowledge, like 50 pages of a book that you want your AI agent to understand, would put these in a vector database. n8n has support to many different vector databases. databases. Let's see, vector. Honorable mentions are Quadrant, which is a very powerful vector database. We have Supabase. This is what I usually use because it can be used as an actual like table, similar to what we saw here. So it looks like a table, but also it has a vector store. So you can actually use it for embedding, and you have the same database to do both. So to evaluate what the AI is saying, let's say like you're storing the conversations, and to actually get company knowledge. So 2 in 1. That's why I love it. It's very simple. And you probably heard about Pinecone. This is what people abbreviate, people show online. It's also quite cool. And yeah, I love that it's just so easy. It's out of the box. So the sky is the limit. If you have a database that you don't find here in the actual implementation, then maybe you can start a ticket for n8n, asking them for this integration. And maybe after a couple of months, you can see this integrations. But usually what I would recommend is use maybe Supabase as your main database. And if you want something pretty, use Airtable. And that usually gets you 99% or solve 99% of the use cases. I hope you enjoyed this short video about databases, and see you in the next one. So in this lecture, I'm going to explain to you quickly what are the authentication methods that we have at n8n. If you don't know what authentication is, think of it as when somebody knocks on your door and you say, who is it? And somebody says, hey, this is Sarab, for example. Authentication is the way to say who is the person knocking on the door. So if you think of an API is basically the door, and we are trying to knock on it. And in this case, we have the Fathom, which is this AI note taker, and we want to tell Fathom that it's me, Sarab, trying to access my recording. And if you know already, if there is no made integration of Fathom or maybe Travely, I think somebody built one already. If there is no built-in integration, we have to do it ourselves. That's why it's really important to know what kind of authentication do we need in case we want to integrate our solution with a tool that doesn't have an integration with n8n. But usually we have still like a lot of applications that are already included. Let's see if Fathom is here. Okay, we don't have it, but we have, for example, Gmail. We have many different things that n8n has simplified the way we can connect with it. So we can just use the pre-built ones, as I'm going to show you in a second. But like, let's say we have an app like Fathom and we would love to integrate it with our workflow. And the way to connect with it is to use this HTTP node. So this is a custom way to call an API. And if you enter, I want to show you what are the things that you would need. Of course, you would need to call the API. Let's say here we want to get all the meetings that you've had. If you're unfamiliar with APIs, you can, or like what are the APIs that I can call from Fathom, you can look into their documentation. But right now, what I'm interested in is more this authentication. So I want to understand here when to use which authentication. So when do I use the header one? When do I use the other one here? So the bearer oath, or sometimes you also might see in n8n there's this oath too. So these are the 3 most common ones that you're going to encounter in n8n. And they might look intimidating at first, but it is pretty straightforward. So most of these authentications, like let's say here and here, they are like header authentication. So if you look into the Fathom authentication, how does it look like? If you're trying to create a header authentication, it's basically all what you need to know is Fathom is going to give you this long string that is kind of secret. So you need to put it there and not really show it or share it with anybody. And it's asking you to put this, it's kind of like a variable, like a name, to put it in front of it. So the header oath consists of 2 things. We have a name, like a key, and the value for this key. So it's literally just like the key to someone's doors. But this key, let's say, it has a specific name that is called X API key. And this is basically the first type of authentication that you might encounter. And some people, if you see here, like in the headers, technically, if you want to send this, so you activate here the header and you need to copy these 2 things. So it's this one, and then here copy the actual value. Of course, if you copy it here, it's not so secure because people can actually read it. That's why I always recommend you to use this generic oath types and then click on the header oath. Where do you get this value? Usually Fathom, once you need to copy their API key, they tell you to add this value in front of it. Some people call it X API key, some people call it something different. So it depends on the provider, how do they want. And to connect with it, basically you just need to adjust the name to it. And that's basically it for the header auth. And then you can basically call this and actually have access if you are authorized. This is the different thing. So anybody now, I'm able to access this data because I'm authorized. This is the key that I actually have for my own account. So if by any chance somebody has access to this, like let's say you now, this is not here encoded, so you can actually copy it. You can copy and access my recordings from your machine. That's why it's really important to make sure that these are secured and nobody has access to them, because anybody with this key can enter your house, basically. If you lost your key, somebody can enter your house. So it is best practice to maybe have expiration date for these, and then maybe after a couple of months, you can just go there and change them. So that's usually also some best practice. But yeah, like you don't go and change all your house keys every couple of months, right? The second type of authentication is called the bearer oath, which basically is the same as the header oath, literally the same. Some websites ask for it, for example, Travelly. And again, if you want to access this, you can either send it as a header or add it here, which I like because it's encoded. Here, luckily, there is no this header, like this name that we had to do before, because it's always following the same header. I'm going to show you how it looks like. It's always following the same kind of structure. But here, let's say we call this, now we get like the actual result. So we are connected to the API. And I'm going to show you a short example. How does it look like? So the bearer oath always follow the same structure. So it has this one as the actual name and then followed by the actual token. So that's why we don't need to write this name anymore, because it's always the same. So whenever you read here authorization, double point, and then bearer, that means you can use the bearer token and just paste this one in the n8n and it will work. The same process goes to, let me show you, for example, whenever you need to create a key, so you go here and then you create a key name like test, and then they give you the actual key so you can read it, copy it, and save it in your n8n. The same process goes in OpenAI. I'm sure you heard like, oh, OpenAI keys. This is basically what it is. So ideally, this one you need to maybe after a couple of months to maybe delete and create a new one. But I've never actually seen people doing this. But basically, anybody with this key can then access my machine. And this is why it's basically, I would consider bearer oath is like a sub option or sub child of the header oath, because it's rather than having this explicit name like the X API key, we would have the authorization, double point, and then bearer, and then the token. Now, if we, as you saw, these two have a little bit of limitation of security. So if somebody has access to your key, or if you lost it or something, they can technically access your data. So right now, the most secure authorization and authentication workflow is this OAuth 2, which is technically what most of these apps are doing. If you see at like the Gmail, let me show you how Gmail is connected. As you know, n8n made it so much easier. So you can just literally sign in and then you are connected. But under the hood, they are using the OAuth 2 API authorization and authentication. So if you have a, let's say a CRM, in my example, I had this complicated CRM called SuperOffice, which is similar to like HubSpot. So it's for sales and stuff, but it had a very complicated authentication. So it usually looks like this. You would start an app kind of in their firewall, and then you would need to give an access to this app from n8n. So this is technically the most complicated one. And if you ever have to do such a thing, you technically need to fill in all these parameters, but they usually give it to you whenever you need to connect with it. So there's usually documentation. They tell you, hey, you need to write the client ID here, the client secret, the access token URL, and the authorization URL. And what this application does is that technically it creates these short-living tokens. It's like, imagine every time somebody knocks on the door, you can handle them like a small key that will open the door for like a limited amount of time, like 30 minutes. And then after that, the key disappears. Like it doesn't work anymore. And this person can then enter the door, I don't know, do certain things in your house and then leave. And then you know exactly who that person is and you gave them this key and then they entered. So this is kind of like the idea behind this authorization. So here in the case that this person loses the key, it's fine. It becomes invalid anyway. So nobody else can access your house if that key was lost. And here what you need to learn is not technically like how this works, but just what are these parameters and how to fill them. And you can then connect to really complicated apps. And actually, as I said, most of the applications like the Gmail, they operate with this authentication under the hood. But luckily for us, n8n made it so much simpler. So just with connect like that, and then you have it all configured. So I hope this was helpful. Technically, in any application, to see what kind of authorization do you need to read their documentation. So usually in the settings, if they offer an API access, you can see what they gave you. If they give you an API key, so every time you hear an API key, it's a very straightforward way to connect. If not, then maybe you need to do something more complicated. But usually most applications, they give you a very straightforward way to understand how to connect with them and also how to call them, most importantly. Like, what are the methods that I need to call? And there's a really nice trick. So in most applications, they give you here the shell. Let's click here. So this kind of it looks like this, like it's a curl command. So if you copy this one, this is the function how to do the search that I just showed you in Travely. You can go here, import curl, and then basically just paste it here. And then you have it here. You see, like when you do this, it actually pastes the actual token that it's a security risk. So we don't want that. We close it, and then we choose the generic. And then we said it's a bearer oath Travely. So this is much better. Then we don't need headers. And the body here, you need to now say like, who is Surab? And that's it. I hope you enjoyed this lecture and see you in the next ones.